Strange Shadows, a Clark Ashton Smith podcast.
Gerard de la Tome was meditating the rhymes of a new ballad in honor of Fleurette as he followed the leaf-erased path toward Vion through the woodland of Averoigne. Since he was on his way to meet Fleurette, who had promised to keep a rendezvous among the oaks and beeches like any peasant girl, Gerard himself made better progress than the ballad. His love was at that stage which, even for a professional troubadour, is more productive of distraction than inspiration, and he was recurrently absorbed in a meditation upon other than merely verbal felicities. The grass and trees had assumed the fresh enamel of a medieval May. The turf was figured with little blossoms of azure and white and yellow, like an ornate broidery, and there was a pebbly stream that murmured beside the way, as if the voices of undines were parleying deliciously beneath its waters. The sun-lulled air was laden with the wafture of youth and romance, and the longing that welled from the heart of Gerard seemed to mingle mystically with the balsams of the wood.
Greetings, friends, and thank you for joining us today for Season 2, Episode 4 of Strange Shadows, where we're working through the weird fiction of Clark Ashton Smith, story by story. The voice you heard at the start there was Jeff Goad of the Appendix N podcast, reading the opening paragraph of today's story. I'm one of your hosts, Rob Poynton.
And I'm the other one, Tim Mendes. Yeah, and today's story we're going to be looking at, which is a bona fide classic of Smith's, I think it's safe to say, A Rendezvous in Averoigne. But we won't be doing it alone. We're going to be joined by an esteemed guest, a returning esteemed guest, indeed, the Prince of Pecuniary Depletion, Mr. Gavin Chappell. How are you doing, sir?
Good day. Yeah, I'm doing fine, yeah. Vanished into a void of silence before. I managed to escape from that terrible fate, and finally I got here. Hello, everyone.
So, Gavin, obviously you're the editor of Lovecraftiana magazine, the Schlock webzine, and various other ventures. Have you got any projects on the boil at the moment?
Well, I'm not editing myself, but Rogue Planet Press has currently got a submissions call for, believe it or not, a Dickensian kind of steampunk sort of anthology. Yeah, Rob's rolling his eyes because he's got a Dickensian anthology coming out at the moment. Yeah, this is not Cthulhu based; it's more kind of steampunk. But yeah, so that's coming out from Sergio Palumbo, and published through Rogue Planet Press at some point. But yeah, currently it's looking for submissions. So if anyone's got a taste for Dickensian, head towards Rogue Planet Press.
Excellent. We'll put that link up in the show notes. And yeah, you have a story yourself in our Hickman papers, which is Dickensian Lovecraft. So yeah, that's
Dickensian Lovecraft. Yeah, I really enjoyed writing 19th century fiction. Not an era I've really entered into that much in the past, but
yeah.
I warn you, it's addictive. I did a bit of it. I've done several more stories of it in a sort of similar style now.
Yeah, it is a style that it's all about. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah, there's some really great stories coming, and the illustrations from Graveheart Designs are excellent as well. So
illustrations are brilliant.
Yeah, as we speak, we're just going through the sort of first draft on that. So hopefully that'll be going to the printer in about 2 weeks' time.
Great.
All right. Shall we return to medieval France and start by looking at the publication history?
Indeed. Yeah, A Rendezvous in Averoigne was completed on September the 13th, 1930. Now, this is going to probably shock you to your core, Rob, but Farnsworth Wright snapped the story up instantly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. A rare event.
Yeah. He loved it by all accounts, and actually said to Clark Ashton Smith in a letter, "I would be insensible to the appeal of pure beauty if I rejected this story. I'm only sorry that we cannot pay a higher rate for it." He was paid $56 for the story.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's not bad, because it's a fairly short story, isn't it? I mean, it's not a...
Yeah. It's about 10 pages, isn't it? Something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Wright wasn't alone in his praise. Lovecraft, by all accounts, absolutely loved it, and wrote in a letter, "Magnificent! Exclamation mark! Exclamation mark! Exclamation mark!" It's a wonder Wright took it, but I guess he was charmed into recognizing merit and laying aside his cheap tradesman standards for once in his life. I don't know when I've ever seen so fine an evocation of malign and sinister atmosphere. Rotting, unwholesome ambiguity drips and oozes and festers on every page. Yeah,
Nice.
he's not wrong, is he? Yeah, and Smith responded that he was great. I'm greatly pleased to learn that the new Averoigne tale was so much to your taste. It is one of my own favourites. In fact, I like it much better than the celebrated end of the story.
Ah, right.
Yeah.
I do. I always like the way that Lovecraft writes in his letters exactly like he writes in his stories as well.
I imagine that's how he talks as well, you know. I like to think that.
Yeah,
Sitting there over a coffee, you know.
I can imagine that. Yeah.
It was eventually published in the April-May 1931 edition of Weird Tales.
I wonder if one of the reasons why Farnsworth Wright was so keen on it is it's one of the few stories that doesn't end with a sad ending. They all die at the end. It's actually got a happy ending, bizarrely enough.
That's a good point. That's actually a very good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. I hadn't picked up on that.
Yes, and it's interesting because to me, it's as descriptive and as flowery, if you like, quite literally in some cases, as a lot of his other stories. But I never understood Farnsworth's standards or why he chose some and others he just outwardly rejected, when to me there doesn't seem to be a lot of difference in the language used.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? I do wonder if it's the setting. You know, because the medieval France, it's kind of tangible, isn't it? Whereas some of the more fantastical realms that he dreams up, maybe that's a part of it that Wright sort of sees like the space set ones as kind of like that's too implausible or something.
Yeah,
Maybe it's too weird for Weird Tales, you know.
Well, perhaps it's because it's vampires as well.
Yeah.
Maybe that's.
Yeah, I'm surprised that Lovecraft liked it because vampires were one of those things that he couldn't stand.
Yeah, he wasn't a
Yeah,
fan of the
yeah.
sort of typical supernatural trappings, was he? Basically, it turns out that it seems like it's one of Smith's personal favourites of his work. I get it because you know he's a poet at heart, right? And it is incredibly poetic, isn't it? It ticks all the Smith boxes, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
I've just got another little excerpt from a letter here. It was this time to August Derleth. Because we've talked before that him and August Derleth used to critique every issue of Weird Tales as it came out, usually quite scathingly,
Oh, very scathing.
and very much so here as well. This is Smith to August Derleth. The last Weird Tales was pretty mediocre on the whole, I thought. My Rendezvous really had no competition, apart from Howard's Tale. The other stories were machine-made thrillers. which just got me thinking now because of that chat GPR or whatever the hell it is.
Yeah.
It just got me thinking. It's just like imagine what we.
That's quite prescient, isn't it? In a way.
Yeah,
What was Howard's story then?
I have no idea. I didn't have a chance to look it up.
Right. Be interesting to find that out.
Yeah,
Is there available anywhere? I don't know if either of you know, or perhaps one of our listeners will know, a sort of table of contents for all the Weird Tales. Has anyone done that? I know you can get sort of digital copies of them and stuff now.
You can get printed copies, actually.
Right.
yeah. Somebody did do a database.
Ah.
There is a database, and it goes episode by episode, issue by issue, story by story. I'll find you the link. I found it a while ago when we did that launch, Lovecraftiana launch,
Right.
and that's where I managed to get hold of a copy of because they've got download links in there as well, and that's where I managed to find out what was in it and all that. And
I think was it Wikimedia? Some form of Wikimedia. It's got pretty much all of them, though sometimes hasn't got all the stories, but it would have the contents presumably.
Yeah, just be interesting to see, because as we sometimes say, there's a lot of other authors that have been lost who were publishing it, and I guess quality probably varies, but it's interesting to speculate how many good authors have been lost as well, even if they just wrote 1 or 2 stories.
Yeah. Well, I have to admit, I've only read about 3 copies of Weird Tales all the way through. Generally speaking, I've found them pretty good. I have to say the first edition, there was some, no, I've not actually finished that. There's some not so brilliant stories in that one, but the ones from the 30s and the late 20s, from what I've read, there's some pretty good stories that have been completely forgotten, sadly.
Yeah.
Well, even in that first issue, there was that one, that ooze or whatever it was. The one with had the cover. Yeah, I read that just after we'd done that launch, and I was like, that's actually really good.
Proto-Shoggoth.
Yeah, it's a proto-Shoggoth, isn't it? It's really good. Yeah.
That's why I wonder it's interesting to be able to chart trends through it, you know.
Yeah.
To see if 1 year a certain type of story was more in vogue than another, or if people picked up on those trends, if the writers picked up on them.
I think you get that towards the end of the 30s, because after Robert E. Howard died, you get quite a lot of people, produce like Henry Kuttner and people like that producing pseudo Conan. Yeah, there was also Cthulhu Mythos stuff at one point, and in the 40s and 50s, it tends more towards, I think, more mediocre stuff. All the kind of Cthulhu or Conan kind of stuff vanishes.
Right.
I believe, but I haven't read them all.
No, just from what I've seen, you do get a lot. It's typical of the time, really, isn't it? The sort of 50s ones. You get a lot of the 40s and 50s ones. There's a lot of Cold War sort of fever. There's a lot of alien invasions and UFOs and all that kind of shit. So
perhaps there's fertile ground there for another podcast. Perhaps working through Weird Tales, that'd be something. Wouldn't
God,
it'd
be awesome.
Only take 30 years. Yeah.
Oh God, can you imagine the work? Yeah.
All right, shall we take a look at our favourite words then for this stuff? Gavin, do you want to start us off?
Now, the one I found most interesting, I think probably the commonest strange word is funereal, which I think he uses about 5 or 6 times. Obviously, to do with a funeral, an adjective derived from funeral, but there are funereal trees, there are funereal, all sorts of things in it. It's remarkable how much can be funereal. I was quite interested as well. Now, one of the things about this story, you're talking about, obviously, Smith being a poet, it's interesting that a poet, a troubadour, is the hero.
Yes.
And of course, he's off to meet his lady love. There's a meal, which is a weird and funereal affair. Funereal meal. Funereal accents of a knell. That's another one.
All right.
Funereal trees. And the foliage is sad and funereal. Yeah. So there's quite a lot of funerealness. But yeah, I was very interested by the ballade. I think it's how you pronounce it. Not a ballad, which is a French medieval poetic form, which I have to admit I've had met before, but only in the Gerard Depardieu film of Sarah de Bergerac, where Sarah de Bergerac composes one while dueling.
Yeah, I love that story, and that was a good adaptation of it as well. I leave you with my panache. And, I guess given the setting, most of the words I've picked out here are French. I liked chaterlaine. That sounded very nice.
Yeah.
Chaterlaine, which is a decorative belt hook that has chains hanging from it, which sounds a little bit odd, but when you see it, you think, oh, yeah, I've seen that in films and stuff.
Yeah. It means a housekeeper. So basically, it's a housekeeper. The chatelaine and a castellan, both who kept a castle, basically. But it came to mean, where the chatelaine kept her keys.
So it's like a key hook on a belt kind of thing.
Yeah.
What about you, Tim? What have you got?
I had a couple. I've got 3. One of which is French. So I'm probably going to mangle this completely. Billet doux. Billets doux.
Billet doux.
Billet doux, which is a love letter. Yeah. This one I liked. It describes skeletal osiers, which is a type of willow.
Yes.
It's a small type of willow tree, and it just brought to mind Blackwood. And the final one I had was adumbration, which I've heard before, but I liked the way it was used in this because it often means an outline, but it can also mean to foreshadow or overshadow. But in this context, it's foreshadowing.
Ah. There's quite a bit of foreshadowing at the start. The point where it talks about how Gerard had forgotten about the legendary of Averoigne, but also there's his hornbeam staff.
Yeah.
Of course, is very important as the story develops.
I was going to mention that.
Yeah, hornbeam staff. Yeah.
Well, it's just typical Smith again, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Going for a tryst with his lover with his hornbeam staff in his hand. Just can't resist it. I had one or two other French ones. There was a pourboire, which is a tip or a gratuity. And then, of course, you think, oh, yes, for a drink, pourboire, which I liked.
Right.
Complaisant, which means willing to please others. So I guess that's similar to compliant. And this reminded me of wafture thin mint, this word.
Wafture thin, yeah.
Wafture, which is just the act of waving or wafting. Is it wafting or wafting? Does it depends if you're from the north or the south, I suppose. Doesn't it? We go for a bit of waft down there.
It's so much better in French.
Yes, most things are. And there was one other word which I knew but I really liked, undines.
Oh, yes.
Which are water sprites, and that's from European mythology. And my final one, which I had to look up, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, is hebitude or hebitude, which is simply dull or lethargic.
That's a good one. I like that.
You learn something new every time you read Clark Ashton Smith.
Oh, from a writing perspective, I'm sure Tim agrees as well. My vocabulary has been increased considerably since the end of this series.
Exponentially.
Yes.
Yeah, exponentially, yeah.
So we are back in the forest in Averoigne with the young Gerard de l'Automne, or as I call him, Jerry Autumn.
So one of us is going to call him Gerard Depardieu now, aren't we?
Well, this could almost be a young Gerard Depardieu, couldn't it? You could quite easily see him in this role. Again, not for the first time, we have a poet as a main character. Or a troubadour, I suppose. I mean, he's a poet, but he's also, I guess, like a minstrel. Is he wandering around with his lute on his back kind of thing, is the impression I get.
And they're usually associated with courtly love, of course. So he's a romantic kind of figure.
Not courtly love.
Courtney Love.
I thought it was a Courtney Love then. I always associate Troubadour with the goth band, The Mission. They had a plastic lobster they used to take on tour with them that they called Troubadour. It was Troubadour the Lobster, and it appeared in their music video.
That's a nice regular gig for a lobster, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
And I like this idea about his love was at that stage, which even for professional troubadour is more productive of distraction than inspiration. There's a couple of things in there. Like one, the idea of stages of love. But people talk about stages of grief, right? But this idea of stages of love, I suppose infatuation is the first one, which I guess is what he's going through at the moment.
It's what we call modern people call the honeymoon period, isn't it? It's
Of course, he's a professional troubadour, so he's got all that poetry to churn out, as well as being in love.
Yes. That's why he's composing while he's walking, I suppose, isn't it?
Better than decomposing.
Not there's an element of that later on. I really like this line as well. The grass and trees had assumed the fresh enamel of a medieval May.
Yeah.
That's so vivid.
I found that quite interesting because apart from anything, it is May, if not medieval. But he is Gerard Autumn.
Yes. Yeah.
Not quite sure what it signifies, but spring, autumn.
I don't know. This seasonal thing is quite interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Maybe the vampires are in the autumn of their years.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I was wondering if it was a common name in France to have. I mean, here you'd have like Winters, I suppose, wouldn't you? Mr.
Yeah.
Winter, Mike and Bernie.
A Lady de Winter.
Yes. Oh, of course. Yeah. Gordon Summers, or is that Summers? I don't know.
Could be.
No, you have Summers. Buffy Summers.
Yeah. I've not heard of Autumn as a name before like that. And I think
As a first name, but that's quite a new thing.
yeah.
There is the musician Emily Autumn,
Ah,
but I think that's actually obviously a stage name.
stage name.
Well, what's spring? It's printemps, isn't it? Spring in French.
I think so.
Yeah, it's printemps. Yeah.
I don't think my GCSE French got that far.
And it's this very typical Smith opening in a way where we get such a vivid description of the surrounding flora and fauna, and everything is bright and everything is lovely, which usually, of course, presages a state of decay. We know that at some point this is all going to change very rapidly.
Yeah. Is that Smith mechanic of it starts off, it's all like here, it's azures and whites and yellows, like ornate broidery. And you've got like the pebbly stream that murmured, and it's all kind of nice descriptions. Then later, as we'll see, they change, and it's such a really powerful way of changing the mood without saying, and the mood has changed. It's a very clever way of doing it, I find. But again, it's almost like we got the sort of like a liminal moment, a threshold, where you go from all the bright and fertile to diseased and rotting.
And of course, Gerard is tempted over the threshold.
Indeed.
A classic maiden in distress.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he fell for that old trick. And it is almost like an enchanted wood, because we get that mention of the undines there parleying deliciously beneath its waters. And also, like, the sun-lulled air was laden with a wafture of youth and romance. And it is this very spring-like, almost enchanted sort of atmosphere.
Mm.
And we learn that Gerard is a trouvère who's quite young, but he's wandered around a bit. He's been around a bit, so he has a certain renown. He roams from court to court, from chateau to chateau, and he is currently the guest of the Comte de la Fresnaye, which immediately put me in mind of Dad's Army.
Yeah.
Yes, Ian Le Fresnaye.
Yeah, because Ian is basically the Scots form of John. When I was writing my story for Musketeers Meet Cthulhu, I think it was very much based on this, but it changed a bit. But I was going to have a character called Jean Le Fresnaye.
Nice. Nice.
And did you use the mansion that's mentioned in your story?
The mansion they mentioned? Not exactly, but it's very much they're going through the forest, and then there's a Gothic mansion, but there's ghouls instead of vampires, basically. Yeah. I ripped it off.
Oh, well, you were inspired by it.
Sorry.
Yeah, and it's here now that he starts thinking about the sort of dark legendary of the place, isn't it? He's but he's one of these guys who doesn't believe in any of that codswallop, But I like that amongst all this, like descriptions of the gnarled and immemorial wood, the ill repute among the peasantry. Somewhere in this wood, there was the ruinous and haunted Chateau des Fassenflammers, which is from End of the Story, isn't it?
Yes. Yep.
There you go.
Yeah, a bit more foreshadowing.
Yeah.
Does that mean false flame?
Yes. Yeah.
Which is an interesting
Probably
name.
did.
It doesn't sound like a typical chateau name, does it? I'm not sure. I think we checked that before. We looked up. We couldn't find any reference to that name anywhere from what I remember.
And also there's a reference to Sir Hugh de Malendois and his chaterlaine and their double tomb, which, of course, we find out more about as the story develops.
Yes. And as we know, Averoigne is a place inhabited by all manner of spectral and supernatural being, because apart from Sir Hugh and his lady, we've got loup-garous, werewolves, goblins, fays, devils, that all infested Averoigne. So it's quite a lively place, isn't it? This forest.
Nice place for a stroll
Yeah.
and a tryst.
Well, that's why they're going there, right? Because they know they're not going to be disturbed because no one else would be
Yeah.
stupid enough to go in there.
Apart from some loups-garoux and goblins.
And the madcap Fleurette, who he's got this assignation with, had professed herself unafraid, but it had been necessary to promise the servants a substantial pourboire since they've shared fully the local superstitions. So she's had to bung the servants a drink to accompany her. I suppose in those days, young ladies never went anywhere unattended, did they?
I find it quite interesting. It goes into some detail about how they managed to meet up. The billet doux ballade, stolen interviews contrived by the help of a complacent waiting woman, made this wooden tryst with him in the absence of her father from Vion, and so on. All the ways they managed to get round Dad, basically.
The servants would withdraw discreetly. Yeah. Oh, I bet they would. Peeking through the bushes, I bet you.
And it's been going for 3 miles and he's not really done anything beyond half of a tentative first stanza of his verse. So he is extremely distracted. And Smith tells us that his thoughts were such as would befit an ardent and impatient lover. We probably don't need to go into too much detail, but I can imagine what is following, if you get my drift.
Spring, isn't it? His sap's rising.
Yeah. That's right. It is Hornbeam staff.
Yeah, it's Hornbeam.
It's Hornbeam staff. Yes. And then comes the scream, a shrill scream that rose to an unendurable pitch of fear and horror, issuing from the green stillness of the pines beside the way.
The voice of a woman in some distressful peril. She's not just in distress, she's in distressful peril.
Yeah. And there's a scuffling as of several bodies. There's obviously some kind of skirmish going on. So he loosens his dagger in its sheath and clutches more firmly a long hornbeam staff which he had brought with him as protection against the vipers which were said to lurk in Averoigne.
Now, don't you think that's interesting? There's stories of werewolves in this forest, fairies, goblins, vampires, but yeah, it's brought a stick in case of snakes.
Just vipers.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the stick does prove to be useful.
Yeah.
Not just against vipers.
Well, there is that. It's Chekhov's hornbeam staff. So yes, in a small open space beyond the trees, he saw a woman who was struggling with 3 ruffians of exceptionally brutal and evil aspect. And there's something strange looking about all of them. The woman was clad in a gown of emerald green that matched her eyes. In her face was the pallor of dead things, together with a fairy beauty, and her lips were dyed as with the scarlet of newly flowing blood. So we're getting indications quite early on that she's a vampire.
Yeah.
And the men were dark as moors, and their eyes were red slits of flame beneath oblique brows with animal-like bristles. And there's something very peculiar in the shape of their feet.
Yeah, what did you make of that? It says all of them were seemingly club-footed.
I was thinking maybe they had cloven hooves.
Yes, that's kind of what I was thinking. I was thinking maybe sort of like a, satyr kind of pan-like.
Yeah. But they don't really come back into it, do they?
No.
They're just there to...
No, they fade away. They vanish. Well, obviously, they're the part of the trap. They did put me in mind a bit of the Men of Leng from Dreamlands. Who have the kind of turbans, don't they, to hide the horns, and I think they have. Do they have hooves?
I think they have something like that. There's something odd about the way they walk. Do they wear shoes that conceal it?
Yeah, sort of like clog-like thing.
Like that.
Yeah.
Somehow we could never recall what sort of clothing they had worn.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if these are woodland folk. The sort of the children of Pan.
Yeah.
Because you've got the story, haven't you? The satyr.
Yeah.
Which kind of ties into this.
But of course, since they just vanish, maybe they're just an illusion.
Yeah.
Yes, because lifting his staff, Gerard rushed upon the ruffians. He struck a tremendous blow at the head of the nearest one, but the staff came down on unresisting air. And the knot of struggling figures just vanishes. Or at least the 3 men vanish. The death-white features of the woman smiled upon him for a moment with faint inscrutable guile ere they melted among the needles.
Something odd's going on.
I like this, that he understood now, and he shivered as he crossed himself. So there you got some more nice foreshadowing there, because that comes back to a moment later on with the hornbeam staff.
And I was thinking at first, this is odd. She's lured him in and then she disappears. Because normally the thing would be, she's lured him towards her. But she disappears as well. But then I guess the reason for this was to get him off the path, basically.
Yeah, he's not just crossing himself, he's crossed into dangerous territory.
Yeah, he's crossed the Rubicon, basically, hasn't he?
Yeah.
It's and this is where we get that shift that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
The foliage about him no longer displayed a brilliant verdure. It was sad and funereal, and the trees themselves were either cypress-like or were already sere with autumn or decay.
Yeah, of course, he's Jared Autumn.
Yes. Yeah, of course. In lieu of the purling brook, there lay before him a tarn of waters that were dark and dull as clotting blood. Nice.
And I love this. Well, actually, just before that, I wanted to say this is like Mirkwood and every single enchanted wood in literature.
Yeah.
Don't go off the path. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, they always do.
And I always do. Or in more modern terms, in Apocalypse Now, don't get off the boat.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. And then, this line I thought was great. The tarn of waters that were dark and dull as clotting blood, and which gave back no reflection of the brown autumnal sedges that trailed therein, like the hair of suicides. That's a powerful image, isn't it?
And this is where we get the skeletons of rotting osiers that writhed above them. It's nice.
And I thought, this put me in mind because there's quite a tradition in this country, certainly in places like Cumbria or down in the southwest, of the haunted tarn.
Yeah.
Or the haunted lake.
Yeah.
And when you see some of these, normally they're sort of quite up on the moors or those sort of remote places. And they're normally quite small, but they just seem very isolated and remote and mysterious.
Yeah, I actually went to one the other day. There's loads of them around here. There's loads of them in Sussex, haunted pools and haunted ponds, and there's nooker holes down here as well.
Oh, right.
Which are, there's several round where I live.
Yeah.
But I went to one out near Horsham the other day, a haunted pool, which was an old quarry that got filled in got turned into an ornamental lake, and apparently there was a disaster there. And some nights the fishermen hear the screams of the dead and dying coming from below the lake, which is very cool.
Wow.
Very good.
Wow.
Yeah.
I was thinking of the Arthurian legend as well, because there's a lot of
Tarn Wathlin.
Yes.
That's in Cumbria, isn't it?
Yes. Tarn Waddling, and Dosmary Pool down near Jamaica Inn. That's where the Lady of the Lake was supposed to be, I think, or where they threw the sword back.
Along with all the other 28 other places where that happened.
Indeed, yeah. And also in the Scottish Highlands, you've always got haunted burns, and there's always a monster or a nixie or something lurking in water up in Scotland, isn't there?
I wonder if it's that thing because it is that change of environment again. You stand on the edge and you're in that sort of liminal space again, and if you go in, it's another world, hidden sort of world maybe.
And of course, there are all the flooded villages at the bottom of lakes.
Oh yeah, there's that one I really want to visit. I think it's in Yorkshire. The one that in the summer when the water level's low, you can actually walk down it, and there's a bridge and a church.
Mm-hmm. There's always a church.
Oh yeah, but you see the spire poking out the water and stuff. It's incredibly cool.
Wow. He's gripping his hornbeam staff more tightly.
Filthy devil.
Oh yes, he had exposed himself. Calm down. He'd exposed himself to the spell and had been lured within the circle of its power in answering that beguileful cry for succor. He's the succor.
And we still get that sort of imagery of the tryst, because we get that the scene was utterly desolate and lifeless, like a place where cadavers might keep their tryst with demons. So that's there's a little necrophiliac tinge as well, which is so common to Smith.
There's another theme, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sort of
makes you wonder. Which was something that Weird Tales kept on flirting with, I believe, not just Clark Ashton Smith, but there were complaints about references to necrophilia from a very early point in Weird Tales. I don't think it was graphic necrophilia, but
wow. It was always hinted at. I don't know if the Love's Dead C.M. Eddy was printed in Weird's House or not, but that was certainly a story that was fairly overt in its subject matter.
I bet that had a lot of people clutching their pearls. You know?
Again, we talked about trends earlier. Maybe that was a thing at the time. That was that was, I don't want to say in vogue. That's not the word, but
back when necrophilia was in vogue.
Necrophilia's in vogue.
It's all the rage.
Necrophilia's back this summer. Everyone's committing necrophilia.
Get digging, folks.
Oh God, Primark's necrophilia collection for the summer.
If they don't complain, it's not illegal. But you know, like you have your sort of satanic panic, don't you?
Oh, yeah.
Or the what was the one we had here, the social services thing up in Scotland?
Yeah, satanic child abuse, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and all that sort of, I just wonder if that was that of its day, perhaps.
Yeah.
Mary Whitehouse and her video nasties. Yeah.
Yeah. Mary Whitehouse and pretty much anything.
Yeah, I was going to say pretty much Mary Whitehouse and breathing. Yeah.
So he's standing on the edge of what I visualize as this haunted lake, and he suddenly notices, because he didn't really spot it before, many turreted castle of hoary stone whose nearer walls were based in the dead waters, which puts me in mind of those lovely old medieval castles that are, well, some, like, is it Leeds Castle? You know, they're surrounded by a lake, and I'm sure there must be French ones the same.
Leeds Castle, yeah.
And there's that Scottish one which appears in all the films. It's in Highlander and so on.
Holy Grail.
Yeah, the Holy Grail. Yeah.
It's where the French taunter
Yeah,
is,
that's
isn't
it.
in the Holy Grail. Yeah.
So the French connection.
Yeah.
It's only a model.
Your mother was a hamster and your father smelled of it.
Oh, here's another Clark Ashton Smith favourite word, coeval. Coeval with fear and darkness.
Yes.
And there's no sign of life about it, but he somehow knows that this is the source, the fountainhead of the sorcery by which he has been beguiled. He's been drawn to the lair.
The source of the sorcery.
The source of the sorcery. How saucy. So, not unreasonably, he thinks, well, I'm not going to hang around here. He renews his prayers. He implores the saints for her safety as well as his own. So, you know, he's not a selfish guy. He's thinking of Fleurette as well. And he finds a trail eventually. But it seems like the forest is trying to impede his escape in some way, which again goes back to our Mirkwoods and everything else.
Yeah. Forests always do that.
And of course, he flees along the trail in the mad hope of eventual escape. And after a short interval, he came again to the shores of the Tarn. So,
yeah. This is a classic.
Yeah. It's that classic thing, and you often get it in stories that use liminal spaces. That sort of loop, you know. I mean, you
keep on coming back to it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's used to great effect in things like Silent Hill, isn't it? And all that kind of stuff. You know, your looping corridors and just But each loop is slightly more and more bizarre. You know?
Well, didn't we get it in Satan Prazeros, which you
indeed,
you came to about before? He tries to run from the tomb, doesn't he? And
he tries to get away, the more he comes back to it. Yeah.
I was wondering if it's as a modern trope, if it was something to do with computer games as well, where you've got the map is only so big.
Yeah.
Well, again, Silent Hill. They did do that because of limitations of the PlayStation hardware. It was like the fog. That was to hide the draw distance. So these things that then became staples of that franchise, and the things that it's most remembered for, was these sort of, like, you'd revisit the same location, but each time it'd be weirder and more bizarre. It was because of the hardware of the time being incapable of keeping up with what they really wanted to do.
Interesting.
I love the line, I think, in the next paragraph. This is real Clark Ashton Smith. His very will was benumbed, was crushed down as by the incumbents of a superior volition that would no longer permit his puny recalcitrance.
Puny recalcitrance, that's great.
Puny recalcitrance and pecuniary depletion. That'd be a great album title, wouldn't
it? So wasn't it an early Genesis album?
From Genesis, yeah.
I was just saying, I take it a margin is a margin, the edge of the tarn.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, the margin
to
of
the
the
tarn.
tarn. That's could be like a title, couldn't it? Like the Emperor of Leng. I am the Margent of Tarn. That's quite a good. I think I'm going to start calling myself that in the future. When they announce me when I walk into a room, behold,
The Margent of
the
Tarn.
Margent of Tarn.
Robot panty nose.
Robot panty nose, yeah. My actual stage alter ego when I was with the Texas Chainsaw Orchestra was Anonymous Bosch.
Anonymous Bosch. Oh, I love it. Yeah, great.
So yes, he's drawn into the castle, and the drawbridge is down. We get the lake is mantled with the iridescent scum of corruption.
Love that.
There's no sign of human occupancy. This is very sort of Dracula-esque, isn't it? In a way, the ruined Gothic castle.
Yeah.
I saw quite a bit of in the main vampire guy. I saw quite a bit of like Lord Ruthven, from Polydori's Vampire. I saw echoes of that.
The Byronic vampire.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have to say, hand on heart, at this point, I'm not a big fan of vampires. I do think they've been done to death, so to speak. But that kind of bit, I mean, the folklore vampires, I think, are brilliant at Crogling Grange and all that kind of thing. But the problem with vampires, the further and further they get into fiction, realistic fiction, even if it's fantastic, it has to have an element of realism. They just don't really work.
Yeah.
Particularly when they start shining and glowing and appearing in twilight and that kind of thing. But I mean, Lord Ruthven is great because he's a guy who dies and comes back, and that's the mystery. It doesn't go into too much detail.
Yeah,
I think that's part of it. And Dracula, he's hardly in the book. That's what makes him so powerful.
Yeah, so one of those creatures that the more you start to analyze it, the more the whole concept of it falls apart. Yeah,
the less it makes sense. Yeah, and you get people having machine guns that fire stakes and that sort of thing. So yeah, okay, that probably would work, but come on, it's just a bit silly.
I think it's a little bit like the Cthulhu mythos in a way, in that the more you explain this stuff and put these limits,
because it comes from the subconscious.
Right. Yeah.
Folklore comes from subconscious, and of course, the Cthulhu mythos also is based on dreams, so it's not going to follow a realistic, everyday kind of logic to it. And when you try and apply that to it, that's when it loses its magic.
Yeah. And I think the same with the werewolves as well, to some extent. A lot of the lore that grows up around it has really come from films in the 20th century rather than legend. Because, the old vampires were not suave. I mean, I know Polidori kind of invented the aristocratic,
or the Byronic.
Well, it's Byron,
vampire.
isn't it? It's basically Byron, yeah. Because prior to that, they're more like sort of zombies or ghoul type creatures, aren't they?
Revenants.
Yeah, revenants. Yeah.
So but this one is, I guess, what we call of the aristocratic cast, but you don't get any sense of the power of Dracula, who seemed to be able to do pretty much anything. Could turn into a wolf, a bat, a mist, had superhuman strength. The powers here seem mostly about luring people in to the castle.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that he's supposed to have been a sorcerer in life, and perhaps that's why he became a vampire in death.
Almost like a punishment, you think?
Yeah.
Cursed with eternal life, sort of thing.
I think in the old folklore, you do get that kind of thing. A man who'd been a wizard in life, coming back from the dead as a vampire.
Yeah.
Well, even criminals, right? Because, I mean, around it in Bedford, there's a highwayman buried in the crossroads at the centre of town. I don't know if he's still there under the roundabout kind of thing.
Yeah.
And they were often staked. Well, Ratcliffe Highway.
Yeah, exactly. Ratcliffe Highway. John Williams is in a crossroads in London, in the East End of London somewhere, with a stake through his heart. Then it's now a major traffic intersection with a kebab shop right over it. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. I've been there.
In the Icelandic sagas, you have something that these creatures, Draug, you may have encountered them.
Right.
Yeah, and they are basically vampires in all sorts of ways, like chopping their head off and sticking a stake through the heart. They keep on coming back, and all the rest of it. But they just don't drink blood. They turn into animals. They all kinds of things that vampires do, but they just don't drink blood. That's the only thing that distinguishes them really, and they're brutal. They're not suave, ironic vampires. Definitely, they're definitely the old kind of vampire. But the only thing that's missing is the blood drinking, which you think is quintessentially vampiric.
Yeah. Do you think that was a Victorian invention, though, the blood drinking? Is that when that came in? That idea of eternal youth, drinking the blood to keep your eternal youth?
It's a good possibility. Yeah.
I've always seen it as a corruption of the Catholic Mass, personally.
Yeah.
You know, the drinking the blood of Christ. I've always seen it as a corruption of that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Like an inversion almost of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But the description we get of this guy, there's very little doubt he's a vampire. The man was inordinately tall and cadaverous, and was dressed in black garments of a superannuate mode. His lips were strangely red amid the bluish beard and mortuary whiteness of his face. They were like the lips of the woman who, with her assailants, had disappeared in a manner so dubious when Gerard approached them. His eyes were pale and luminous as marshlights, and Gerard shuddered at his gaze and at the cold, ironic smile of his scarlet lips. So that's pure vampire lord, isn't it?
I imagine him being played by Christopher Lee, to be honest.
Yeah.
Particularly inordinately tall.
To be honest, when I was reading it, it was basically describing my entire dance floor and when I do my club nights once a month. That's my clientele.
I love that clip of the bats.
The bats that's upside
Have
down.
you seen that, Gavin?
That's right.
There's bats sleeping and someone's flipped the picture the other way up and put a goth soundtrack to it, and it's goths dancing.
It's a Sisters of Mercy track they put on it. Yeah.
I'll put the link up because it is so funny.
Yeah.
And you can even picture this guy speaking. I know it's in France, but I kind of hear this as, "Fortune has willed that you shall become my guest." The man went on.
It's all a bit Bela Lugosi, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's all gone Bela Lugosi.
Which I suppose was coeval with this story. When was the first Dracula film out? That was
20s, isn't it?
You had Nosferatu in the 20s, but I'm trying to think the Bela Lugosi was about 30.
It was the 30s,
32?
yeah, early 30s. Yeah.
Yeah, all those Universal ones, they were going at exactly the same time, really. It's odd you don't get that many references to them. It's like they were existing in a different dimension.
Yeah.
It is strange, isn't it? I did see something recently. There was a post about, does anyone have a list of the films that we know Lovecraft saw?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
He does write about a couple, but he doesn't really mention much. And you think he'd be going to see The Hunchback and Nosferatu. Well, I suppose Nosferatu wasn't distributed, was it, at the time?
Yeah, I wondered sometimes if King Kong and Cthulhu might have some kind of link. They both got a Pacific island and they're both big. Well, apart from that, there's no similarity.
Yeah.
Really. Well, it's a kind of prehistoric Pacific big. What else do you need?
They both start with curse sounds.
I hadn't thought of that. 3 things.
The only one I can think of around the sort of time that Lovecraft was alive that would have been vaguely sort of similar was Kaltiki, the immortal monster. Because I think that was 30s.
Yeah.
And that was kind of a bit Cthulhu-esque.
Maybe that's something we should look at in Innsmouth Book Club sometime. Do a special on that.
Yeah.
We do weird fiction from the time, but never weird film. That'd be.
That's a really good idea. We should, we'll cover that because I've got it, so you can watch it whenever.
Of course, Lovecraft didn't he work in a cinema for a while, something like that? I read that quite recently. He was.
I think he did at one point, like a ticket office or something.
Yeah, something like that. Which quite surprised me because I didn't think he ever had a proper job in his life.
Yeah, I don't know how long it was for. Perhaps a listener can write in and tell us. Can you imagine if you'd have known going to see a horror film and you buy your ticket off a Lovecraft? I'd be terrified. I'm not going in there.
Tentacle creeping up the back of your seat, tickling the nape of your neck.
When he wasn't impersonating vampires in cemeteries and scaring young ladies.
That's amazing.
Tickets.
One of the good things about this is it doesn't say, oh, he was a vampire. I mean, there's that reference to vampires before, but there's a bit where when his lips parted, Gerard had a glimpse of teeth that were unnaturally small and were pointed like the fangs of some fierce animal.
Yes.
It's a vampire. It's a vampire.
And it is the classic thing again of, oh, you must come in, rest a while. And no, I'm very busy. I've got an appointment with my friend near Vion. Oh, unfortunately, there are no paths from my chateau to Vion, the stranger replied. As for your rendezvous, it will be kept in another manner at another place than the one appointed, which is not boding well for Fleurette, is it?
No.
Yeah. In modern terms, your car's broken down.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly what it is, isn't
Can't
it?
get the engine started.
I love this line. I love this line. I must therefore insist that you accept my hospitality. Friendliness as threat. I like it.
And enter, I pray, but leave your hornbeef staff at the door. You won't need that. Oh, yes, you will.
Could come in handy.
Well, he does insist on keeping hold of the staff, right? Because he makes this thing up on the spot. I have made a vow to carry it with me in my right hand or never beyond arm's reach till I have slain 2 vipers, which is quite quick thinking on his part, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like it. It's that sort of crap that comes out of your head when you're under duress, isn't it?
It does sound very medieval. It does sound like the kind of oath, bizarre sort of oath that a character in Arthurian romance might come out with.
It is very Green Knight Gawain, isn't it? It's very much one of these stupid oaths that it's like, why did you ever make that?
I also like the bit about the moue of distaste and aversion that the vampire makes with his over-red lips as he spoke the last sentence. His eyes lingered on the staff with obscure apprehensiveness.
And this is a proper Gothic castle, right? We've got cressets burning in the dim hall.
Gonna have crescents.
Yes, we've got dark, heavy doors of dark and sombre wood. We've got several people seated about a long table by the light of cressets. In the strange, uncertain glow, their faces were touched with a gloomy dubiety, with a lurid distortion, and it seemed to Gerard that shadows hardly distinguishable from the figures were gathered around the board. That's almost like this sort of ghostly assembly around the dining table.
Yeah. Like the corpse at the feast, except they're all corpses.
Yeah. Reminds me in that scene of the fearless vampire killers, vampire hunters.
Yeah.
Where they're having the big ball at the end and someone pulls the curtain aside from the mirror and there's only the 2 humans dancing around the room. It's a really nice scene.
Yeah.
And you've got the woman in emerald green making a second appearance. So she was real, sort of.
And at her side sits Fleurette.
Fleurette herself.
And her maid and manservant, who she bribed to come with her, are sat at the lower end of the table, reserved for retainers and inferiors. So even in perilous circumstances, the servants have to sit at the other end.
Looking very pale and forlorn and frightened.
Yeah. Well, you've got to preserve these things, or the place would just go to the dogs. Standards must be upheld.
I like this, that even this, there's a sense of social order, because Sieur de Malimbois basically comes and sits at the head of the table, doesn't he?
Exactly, even in death or undeath.
Yeah.
And in fact, their servitors come in and go in, setting upon the table various wines and viands. The servitors were preternaturally swift and noiseless, and somehow it was very difficult to be sure of their precise features or their costumes. So that mirrors the ruffians he saw earlier, right? He can't quite make them out.
Ah, good point.
And he does think there might be a resemblance. So perhaps these are their undead servants or spirit servants or something. This then kind of sounds like one of those, if you've ever had one of those really horrifying family Christmas dinners. Everyone's sort of sitting around going, weather's nice, isn't it?
Oh, yes. Yeah, kind of reminds me of the dinner scene in Texas Chainsaw Massacre a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, it's funereal again.
Yeah. Smothering horror and hideous oppression. Now there's an album title.
But this food and drink does seem to be real, at least for the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the whole place seems to be real at the moment.
At the moment, yeah. And again, this is typical Smith, that The foods were rich and of strange savour, and the wines were fabulously old, and seemed to retain in their topaz or violet depths the unextinguished fire of buried centuries. It's interesting. How can you get so much from a sip of wine? Isn't it? You know?
If you've ever been to a wine tasting, that pales into comparison to some of the cobblers some people come out with. Trust me.
Oh, right. I'm getting nutmeg and autumn.
It reminds me of the willow trees on the slopes of that. Shut up and drink your wine.
I just always like that. I don't know if it's not the 9 o'clock news or something. They did the wine tasting sketch, and it was,
yeah.
I'm getting pissed.
Yeah.
That's about it.
And again, there's some lovely writing here. Well, this is, I guess this is where Smith excels in this kind of scene, is it? The undead, the necromantic, the vaguely necrophilic, and the old and the ancient. Above the aromas of the rare foods, the bouquets of the antique wines, there crept forth the choking mustiness of hidden vaults and embalmed centurial corruption, together with the ghostly spice of a strange perfume that seemed to emanate from the person of the chaterlaine. And now he thinks back to those stories about the Sieur de Malembourg and his lady. So never mind the vipers, although the staff is going to come in handy against the vampires as well. Dual purpose.
Vampires and vipers.
Yeah.
Mm.
And he actually remembers the folklore superstition concerning the use to which a wooden stake can be put. So I suppose this is quite an old tradition with vampires. As we said before, a lot of these people were staked, and there's speculation it was like an iron stake into the earth. So your like energy or power was drained into the earth or something.
Yeah, sort of tethering your spirit, basically, so it couldn't go wandering and haunting low nearby villages.
Yeah. Also, chopping the head off is another one of those things you get.
Yeah.
I find that tends to work for most things, though.
Yeah. You're not going to walk when you had your head chopped off. But there's one of the Icelandic sagas, one of the undead characters in that. There's basically his wife gets him murdered by her brothers or something like that. I forget exactly why. They basically drag him off, chop his head off, and then she goes back home, gets into bed, and then he gets into bed next to her with his severed head in his hands. And later on, he turns up again in the story in a battle, and he uses his head as a weapon.
That's awesome.
And there's no explanation for it. There's no justification for it. There's just this character who has his head chopped off and then just gets back into bed with his wife.
Head as a weapon, that's marvellous. That. Did he have quite long hair? Was he like swinging it around?
It does not really specify. It's just he bashes people over the head with his own severed head.
That's what you call hard, isn't it?
I wonder if that's where the inspiration for that episode of The Young Ones comes from, where you've got the two headless guys that end up having a scrap in the kitchen while the young ones are going about doing whatever they're doing, and they're walloping each other with their heads.
So the meal is over. We get a little bit about the staff again, and I like this when he remembers this folklore superstition. Gerard sort of shuffles the staff a little bit closer to him and puts his foot on it. Make sure that's not going anywhere.
It's a nice touch.
Because then we get, it's meal is over, time for bed. You will each be assigned a room, a separate chamber, if you so desire.
No, we'll all bunk together, thanks.
And again, the proprieties are being adhered to. Fleurette in one chamber and Gerard in another chamber. Nothing naughty going to be going on here.
Yep. And even the servants, right? The manservant Raoul is with Gerard. And Fleurette as her maid, Angelique.
Yeah. Want no rumpy pumpy in the castle tonight.
not under my roof.
Yeah, not under my yeah, it's classic. Yeah.
And the rooms are again, they're very plush, as you might expect, but of an antique fashion and fabric. It makes you wonder, what was antique in the Middle Ages? Was that like a sort of leather curtain or something? It's interesting. We've got funereal again with the lighted tables. And the air is still stagnant with the mustiness of dead years.
I love this thing now because as soon as they part, Gerard and Fleurette, he began to curse himself for a poltroon. I love it. Curse himself for a poltroon. Yeah, because he'd not refused to part from her side. And this way he sort of marvels at a spell of drug-like involution that had bedrowsed all his faculties. So again, we got some nice foreshadowing there.
And their host says, "May you sleep soundly," before exiting and locking the door behind him. I bet that was Count, wasn't it? That wasn't really Bela Lugosi.
That was the Count. Yeah. Oh, what a nut.
Yeah, in an unpleasant and oily and sepulchral tone. Oily and sepulchral. And even the manservant Raoul is wise to what's going on. "I think, Messiah, that we have been decoyed by a malefic sorcery, and that you, myself, the demoiselle Fleurette, and the maid Angelique are all in deadly peril of both soul and body." Though he's wishing he never took that gratuity now, that pourboire.
Yeah, Gerard's obviously onto it as well. Yeah, and says so, and it's here that he says, "I believe it would be well that you and I should sleep only by turns, and that he who keeps vigil should retain in his hands my hornbeam staff, whose end I shall now sharpen with my dagger." So yeah, but and this is what I was saying earlier. He's obviously a man. He's obviously a man with faith, because he then carves a crucifix on his staff. Just in the hope that it will make it more, potent against his foes.
Efficacious.
Yeah, +1 staff.
Yeah.
Whittled the hard wood to a lance-like point and hid the shavings carefully.
That's a nice little touch, isn't it? He brushes the shavings under the bed, kind of thing. Yeah. And he says Raoul can sleep first. He's going to take first watch. And they have a little chat for a while. And you get the story of how Fleurette and the 2 servants were led astray as well and brought to the castle.
By the sobbing of a woman.
So that's interesting that his lure was the peril, the woman in danger, because him being a man, I suppose. But for Fleurette, the lure was a woman in distress, but of a more emotional kind, I suppose.
Yeah, the weeping woman in the woods.
And of course, Raoul nods off, and Gerard does his best to stay awake, but no doubt is under the malefic influence of the Count. So he nods off as well. And he heard through his growing hebetude a whisper as of shadowy wings in the castle halls. He caught the sibilation of ominous voices, like those of familiars that respond to the summoning of wizards. Again, that idea that the vampire could be a sorcerer or was a sorcerer.
Yeah, it's a nice touch, isn't it? It's
And of course, on waking up, daylight filtering through the windows, and poor old Raoul is looking a bit pale and lifeless. This is great. Pale and lifeless on the couch with the air and look of an exhausted moribund. Exhausted moribund.
We know who's done it. A phantom spice arose from the couch, a lingering wraith of the perfume worn by the chaterlaine. I don't know if that's Agatha or Agath or what exactly, but...
Yeah, it's an interesting spelling, that is. I don't know, maybe that's like an old way of spelling the name.
Yeah, presumably French spelling, but I don't know about the pronunciation.
Yeah. And Raoul is still alive, but he's very weak and drowsy again. It's classic vampire victim. He's got a couple of holes in the neck. He's very pale.
I think one who's lost a great amount of blood.
Yes. And again, he's very switched on, Raoul. These vampires mean to hold us here amid their unhallowed necromancies till they have drained us of our last drop of blood. Their spells are like mandragora or the sleepy syrups of Cathay, and no man can keep awake in their despite.
Sleepy syrups of Cathay. Presumably a reference to opium.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess that is, yeah. And yet, in her feeding, or post-feeding, post-prandial, Agatha has made a mistake because she's left the door unlocked on her departure.
Oops.
A fatal mistake.
It's that thing you often find that with these people, you get it with like real life, like serial murderers. In the end, they don't get caught through any police work. They get caught because they make a mistake, because they get complacent. And it's a common trope in horror movies, isn't it?
A fatal flaw.
They're last in a long line of victims, but these guys, they're sort of like, yeah, this guy's not going to be any kind of problem. We'll just, drug him, knock him out. Yeah, it'll be fine. And he wakes up and kills them. So you get that sort of trope here, don't you?
It's a sort of arrogance, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, yeah, they leave the room and he manages to find Angelique and Fleurette, who have had very similar experiences. Angelique has been drained, a mark on her white neck, similar to the wound that had been suffered by Ariel. It's funny how they start drinking the servants first, isn't it? Are they like a starter, do you think?
Hors d'oeuvres, yeah.
I think I have the manservant as a starter. Yeah. Or shall I have the white bait? I'm not sure.
I love the line. Raoul staring stupidly at the tomb. What now, Messiah? He queried. You and I, Raoul, are about to intrude upon the bedchamber of our host and hostess.
And the ending comes with pretty much what you'd expect.
Yes.
Basically, they're going to hunt down, find where the vampires are sleeping, and apply the staff.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Gerard recalls the legends of that apparently the tomb was supposed to be still visible in the woods, wasn't it? And he remembers this and thinks, well, if the rest of this place is an illusion, I've just realised the Mickey Mouse and the Castle of Illusion. It's sorry, I don't know why that just popped in my head, but it did. But he realises that's the sort of only tangible part of this castle. So off they trot, staff in hand.
But also like the way when they go into the castle to find this place, that it almost put me on like a hall of mirrors or something. That there's all these sort of secret doors and blind outlooks onto a courtyard and this kind of stuff. Like it's purposefully confusing. So even though the vampires are asleep, there's still this element of a spell going on.
Yeah, it's almost like the labyrinth, isn't it? It's
yes, and they find the slab. With Herculean effort that strained their bones and sinews to the cracking point, they sought to remove it, but the slab hardly stirred. At length, by grasping the same end in unison, they were able to tilt the slab, and it slid away and dropped to the floor with a thunderous crash.
It's so vivid that, you can just imagine exactly what it'd be like.
Yeah. Yanking on the edge, on the corner, yeah.
And the crash as it goes down,
and it's probably shattering into 2 or 3 pieces or something as it hits the floor.
Yeah, because of the films that I watch and the TV that I watch, I imagine the lid coming off and bouncing a little bit because it's made of polystyrene.
Budgets being what they are.
Exactly.
There's a crash sound effect that doesn't quite fit.
Yeah, it doesn't quite.
And inside, in 2 open coffins, are Sir Hugh and Agatha. Both of them appeared to be slumbering peacefully as infants. A look of tranquil evil, of pacified malignity, was imprinted upon their features, and their lips were dyed with a fresher scarlet than before. And this is where the lore can change again, because I'm sure in some of the Hammer Dracula films, he's dispatched with a stake, and then someone comes along 20 years later and removes the stake, and is sort of reanimated, isn't he? But this is like staked, done, staked, done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is almost the Buffy the Vampire Slayer kind of slaying, isn't it? You stab them with the stick, and they go poof, basically.
But who knows? Them being vampires, they might be able to coalesce at some other time. If some blood falls upon the dust of the vampire.
Yeah. They usually get found by someone, don't they? A follower or an acolyte, and who sprinkles blood onto them. Perhaps that's what will happen here as well, because they both crumble into ashes. A slight odour as of age-old corruption arose to the nostrils of Gerard, and of course the whole castle dissolves like a sullen vapour. They rolled away on every side with a shock as of unheard thunder. Unheard thunder, that's an interesting one, isn't it?
Mm.
I suppose a shock of unheard thunder. It's you feel it, but you don't hear it.
And I guess you'd feel the electricity, wouldn't you, and the shock wave. Yeah.
Yeah. And perhaps the shaking of the ground. But shock wave,
Yeah. Because we had a big storm here a couple of days ago, thunder and lightning, and it is that you feel that build up, don't you? Before,
Oh yeah,
that gathering tension.
that's it.
Yeah.
As other than heard thunder, so the whole thing just vanishes.
Yeah.
The moment they're killed, as if it's them.
yeah, even the lake goes and it's rotting shores,
Yeah.
and they're back in the normal forest glade. So is this place, like we said, is this fairyland, an alternate dimension they've gone through, or is it just an illusion in our world?
Or was it the night-long labyrinth of an evil dream?
It's back to that lore thing of there's not a thorough explanation of everything.
This is it. It's again, it's the ambiguity that I really like in Smith's work.
Yeah,
because you can interpret it in several different ways, and I think that's why they endure these stories.
So, yeah, it's just something weird and wonderful. I mean, when I think probably the origin of the vampire myth is the fact that some bodies don't rot or don't rot for a long time, and you get these stories about people, for whatever reason, disinterring a body and they found it hadn't rotted, therefore it was a vampire. But the weird thing is, you get the same thing about saints, like Saint Cuthbert, for example. His body hadn't rotted, but that's a sign of sanctity and not a sign of him being a vampire.
Yes.
Or was it?
Yeah. Oh, I never thought of that. Yeah, because it's the same thing on each side. As I say, on some corpses, you have the hair or the nails will keep growing as well.
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah.
And I guess disinterment was probably quite a common thing back in the day. I mean, especially in London, where they were digging up bodies every few years to stick them in a pit and cram a few more in.
They're going to have trouble on Judgment Day.
Yeah.
Well, I actually watched a documentary about a decade ago. It was actually narrated by Anthony Head. And it was each episode was about like the origins of monsters, basically. So you had one on werewolves, and the one on vampires was really interesting because it basically went to this little village in Romania, and there'd been some like subsidence, and obviously the coffins had come out the graveyard, and they hadn't decomposed. So people thought that, like, the dead were rising, and that's thought to be one of the origins of it. It doesn't really go into sort of the movie aspect. It's all about the folklore. It's really interesting.
Yeah. But in the Balkans, they still believe, or some people still believe, in vampires.
Yeah.
When Milosevic was, when he died, there was a group of vampire hunters who dug him up and put a stake through his heart.
Wow, didn't know that. Wow.
Sounds like a pretty sensible thing to do, really, just in case.
Yeah.
But that's another thing. The vampire as an evil man in life who becomes a vampire after death.
Which in some respects is the whole root of the Dracula myth, right? I mean, Vlad Tepes.
Yeah.
And how much Dracula is Tepes and how much it isn't, I'm not quite sure. Again, because there's all this other stuff piled on top of it now, and our conception of the character is probably not as pure as it was if you just read Dracula and not seen any of the films.
It's very similar with Elizabeth Bathory as well. How much the fact and fiction have become entwined in that.
Yeah.
So as you said at the start, Gavin, it's a happy ending. Well,
a happy ending from Clark Ashton Smith.
It could be taken in a couple of ways, because I think Sweetheart said, Gerard, that our next rendezvous will not be interrupted by the Sieur de Malemboy and his chaterlaine. But Fleurette was still bemused with wonder and could only respond to his words with a kiss.
Oh.
At which point, I imagine that the servants discreetly draw away.
I was just going to say, as they're kissing, his hand behind the back, like shooing them off. Off you go, lad. Off you go.
Do they need another pourboire after that?
I imagine so, yeah.
Pretty sizable pourboire this time.
There's just one other thing I wanted to mention in the story, because there's a local connection. Because Smith says at one point about being in the slough of despair, or the slough of despair, which probably, I mean, we can't say for certain, comes from the Slough of Despond by John Bunyan. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Bunyan was a local lad to here, Bedford.
Was he?
And it's believed the Slough of Despond was inspired by Squitch Fen.
Right.
which was between the village where he was born and the next village, which is now, it's just on the outskirts of Bedford now, a place called Harrowden. And even now, Harrowden has one street and 18 houses.
But it's pretty expensive to live in these days.
Not from the looks of it.
Oh, right.
Because I think Squitch Fen is still there.
Oh, right. They haven't drained it.
Yeah, I'm going to go down because nearby there is a very old medieval hall.
Yeah.
Which Bunyan must have known. I think in the next village along, they've got a lot of the old 16th, 17th century buildings still there. So I shall go and take a look down there one day. Yes, so there we go. A nice little local reference as well.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a pretty interesting story. And I'm not surprised that Farnsworth Wright, I think even Farnsworth Wright could not help himself from enjoying it.
Yeah, it's like that quote from him. I can't recall reading any quotes from him that have been that enthusiastic.
Yeah.
You know, it's usually like, yeah, it's a good story. Well, he was kind of one of them kind of chaps, wasn't he? He was all man of few words from what I can gather.
That's right.
To...
Incidentally, I had a quick look on ISFDB and found out that the Howard story, it's Robert E. Howard rather than Howard Phillips Lovecraft, and it was The Children of the Night, which is one of his Little People stories, if I remember correctly.
Yes. Is that's either the one where the guy is a Pict, like reincarnation, and he kills him because he's a Pict, or it's the one where the guy goes back in time?
Yeah.
I can't remember which.
And becomes Conan of the Reavers. Yeah, it's one of those ones.
Yeah, it's one of his Macon-esque ones, isn't it?
I think it's that one, yeah.
So it's kind of like a Worms of the Earth almost.
Yeah, it's very much part of the same kind of mythology within the Cthulhu mythos.
Yeah, it's that, yeah.
Yeah, because we said that when we covered Worms of the Earth on the IBC, that Howard said it in the Fens of the West when the Fens are in the East.
Yeah.
But we figured it was because it was the Welsh borders, so it tied in all the Maconesque.
Yeah, yeah, which all comes from Arthur Machen.
No, it's actually the one you were talking about, the one where there's a man called Kettrick. It's one of the Kirwan.
Yeah.
There's a man called Kettrick, they're all Anglo-Saxon apart from Kettrick.
Is a bit snaky, isn't it? A bit Ophidian, I think was the.
Although he possesses a documented pure Anglo-Saxon lineage, he appears in sort of slightly Mongolian-looking eyes and an odd lisp that O'Donnell finds distasteful.
Oh dear, Mr. Howard. It's of its time, I suppose.
Very much so. Yeah. So that was the only other story in that edition of Weird Tales that the gang thought was any good.
Yeah.
So there's very little in the letters in the Dawnwood Spire collection relating to this. The title is mentioned a couple of times between Smith and Lovecraft, but there's nothing other than that.
Yep.
But speaking of letters, I believe we've had a couple of missives in by email.
Indeed, we have. Yeah, our first one is from Kerry O'Brien in Kansas in the USA. And it's Gentlemen, I listened to your recent discussion of the Willow landscape, a Smith story I'd previously read. You may be interested to know that the Algernon Blackwood story, The Man Who Was Milligan, in 1923, also features a character who disappears into a Chinese painting. Perhaps if you read the Blackwood story, you can comment on the similarities and the possible influence on Smith's story. That is a great idea. I have that. So, yeah, I think we probably should. I'll definitely give that a read and comment on that next time, maybe.
Yeah, or perhaps we'll put that on the list for IBC as well, because we've only done, we need to go back to Blackwood. Yeah, thanks for that, Kerry. Yeah, and we did get another message in. I think it was from our friend Just Joe, who mentioned an episode, I'm not sure of which show it was, but it was the Twilight Zone or one of those shows where a man escapes into a painting. So
It was Night Gallery.
Night Gallery, right.
It was an episode of Night Gallery.
So thanks for that, Joe. We'll look up that episode as well, and that might well go on our list of when we do our TV adaptations. I don't think it was a Smithian adaptation as such.
No.
But nonetheless, there's so few of those, we might need a few extra stories to put in there. And our second message is from our friend Mark Griffin of the 30 Plus Minutes with H.P. Lovecraft podcast. Mark writes, I like that the title of his email was Nothing Quotidian About Strange Shadows. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Hello, the red world of Polaris would make for a great film adaptation, but it needs to be done in a retro future fashion. The ship Alcyone needs to have levers and pulleys for the crew to move back and forth like a Fritz Lang classic. Roverton sports tweed, bushy mutton chops and a monocle, absolutely.
Absolutely.
The titular planet could be nothing more than a Christmas ornament. The only CGIs would be reserved for the denizens of the Red World. On another note, robot was coined in Capex's play RUR, Rossum's Universal Robots, in 1920. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah. I'm just picturing the effects as very much 1960s Doctor Who. You know, BBC budget effects, you know, that's how I'm picturing it.
Baco foil.
The set people walk into with a clunk.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And a monster made of bubble wrap. Yeah.
Definitely. Green bubble wrap.
Oh, yeah, green bubble wrap. Had to be green.
That's where the budget went.
Yeah. Well, it was new technology at the time. We laugh at it now, but that was new and exciting back then.
Well, you know what it was? They had to order 2 lots because the first lot arrived, a huge roll of bubble wrap. They gave it to the assistant and said, "Can you just pop that in the corner?" So, non-Euclidean humour. So there we are, folks. Rendezvous in Averoigne. I think a Clark Ashton Smith classic, we all agree. Most enjoyable. Thanks very much for coming in, Gavin, and chatting to us. Always a pleasure.
It's for me too.
And speaking of thanks, I'd also like to thank our wonderful patrons who help support the show. If you'd like to join them, then take a look at our Patreon page. You can join at 3 levels of membership, and everyone gets access not only to bonus content for Strange Shadows, but also for our sister podcast, the Innsmouth Book Club. So what are we going to be looking at next time, Tim?
Next time we're going to be looking at, we're going to do another one of our lovely patron exclusives, and we're going to be looking at the letters of Clark Ashton Smith with various other people. We do, thanks to Just Joe, actually, we have another source for some of these, letters with Dodson. So I'm going to be diving into those as well. So should be entertaining.
Oh, that's going to be interesting. And I should also mention, by the way, our patrons also get free entry to a certain event called the Innsmouth Literary Festival.
Yeah, they do indeed. Yeah, and if you're not a patron but you do want to attend, tickets are on sale now. They're £20. That gets you entry for the day, and you can get them through Eventbrite.
And I would say we do have a limited number of tickets, and about a third of them have already gone. So do get over there quickly. We wouldn't want you to be disappointed.
Yep.
Wouldn't want you to miss the chance to visit Innsmouth for a day.
Exactly.
Hurry up. Roll up. Hurry.
Get your tentacles here. And on that note, thanks everyone for listening today. We'll see you next time. It's goodbye from me, Rob Poynton.
It's goodbye from me, Tim Mendes.